All right. Well, welcome everybody to our last meeting until the fall. My name is Erin Frigo. I'm the president of the Panhandle Archaeological Society of Texas. Our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Matthew Hill, talking about his research titled The Pueblo in Kansas, the Apachean and Puebloan Communities on the High Plains of Kansas. And at this time, we would ask that everyone please turn off your speakers just to minimize interference. And if you're gonna have your camera on, that's fine. But if you think you're gonna be walking around a whole lot, like you might want to turn your camera off just to minimize distractions. Other than that, the floor is yours,
Okay.
Matt.
Thank you so much, Erin, for inviting me. Let me share my screen. All right. Okay. Okay. Can you see that?
Yes, everything
Okay.
looks good.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I want to tonight. What I want to do is I want to talk about uh, some research uh, that we've been doing for almost the last 20 years. And in the title slide, while I'm um, uh, presenting today, this really is the result of a collaborative project with Dr. Margaret Beck, who's a professor here and basically my partner in everything. But we have been looking at the history of ancient plains Apache people in the Central Plains. Archaeologically, it's known as the Dismal River aspect, which is arguably one of the worst names archaeologists have ever applied to any complex. And what's unique about the Central Plains Apache history and what we have really focused most of our work on over the last few years is not just their appearance on the plains, but their kind of unique interaction with Rio Grande Puebloan people on the Great Plains. And the primary site I want to talk about today is what we refer to as the Scott County Pueblo, which is in, as the name implies, Scott County, Kansas, and is one of the oldest known investigated archaeological sites in Kansas. It has well over 125-year history of archaeological work, but it epitomizes the unique relationship between ancestral Apache people and Puebloan people and their lives on the plain. And so I kind of just want to talk about this and talk about the kind of changing social landscape that's on the Great Plains, right around the time of kind of colonial context and slightly before. So when I talk about the um, the ancestral Apache group and talk about the Dismal River, it is a archaeological complex known from across western Kansas, Nebraska, eastern Colorado, and eastern Wyoming. And in terms of number of sites, it's actually a fairly well-represented archaeological assemblage. There's almost 300 known sites. Now, this archaeological expression seems probably better than it is. The reality is most of these reported sites are kind of surface scatters of artifacts of lithics or some pottery. About a little over a third of them are actually multi-component sites. So they have earlier late prehistoric, woodland, even some archaic and Paleo-Indian levels associated with these sites. And for a whole series of historic reasons, a whole number of these sites were identified even though they lacked any kind of diagnostic artifacts like ceramics or lithics. And were mostly identified because they were generally considered young, high up um, in a kind of a profile, thinking about. So it's a recent site, but it lacked uh, mostly lacked metal or evidence of historic contact. As a result of the kind of squirrely nature of some of these sites, many of them are very likely misidentified as ancestral Apache. But for a large number of them, there is very good reason to think they are ancestral Apache due to the associated artifacts. Most predominantly is their ceramics, a very distinctive thin-walled uh, vessels that are either have a smooth surface or a simple stamped surface treatment. There are some other diagnostic artifacts, such as a particularly Apache style tubular pipe, often made of clay. Uh, they These sites are often associated with spurred end scrapers, um, which are an unusual artifact that is actually quite common in very early Paleo-Indian sites, but does show up in some numbers at Dismal River sites. Others have argued that there are these unusual bipointed bifaces, these kind of two-sided knives or Shoshone knives, but called by some, or their projectile points, these kind of shallow side notch points, often that themselves have a little spur on those. So there does seem to be diagnostic artifacts that indicate an Apache presence at many of these sites. Now, because it extends across the high plains and off the high plains, particularly to the east, to into the Rocky Mountains, there's a huge geographic variation, very likely that are reflecting larger environmental or climatic differences across the kind of east-west across the plains. In the eastern plains, kind of think east of roughly 102 West Meridian, an area that is probably gets enough precipitation for dryland farming. In the eastern parts of the Dismal River Range, many sites seem to be more sedentary. People are living there perhaps year round, but for a more extended period of time. Um, in the eastern sites uh, is where you find the very large sites. And when I say large, I'm talking about sites that cover multiple acres, in fact, hectares of size that are associated with thousands or tens of thousands of artifacts. These generally have well-built structures, um, very similar to kind of Navajo wickiups, but often with clay-packed sides that are perhaps 5 to 6 meters across, quite pretty large. Eastern sites also are known for having an extraordinary number of extramural pits that are used for cooking or roasting and storage. Um, in the east, there is generally less use or limited use of rock shelters as seasonal sites. Now, in the west, it's kind of a different thing. Western ancestral Apache Dismal River people seem to be residentially more mobile. They're not sedentary. They move around a lot. As a result, their sites are often small with often very few artifacts. If there are structures, it is primarily teepee rings, and there is some use of rock shelters in this area. Um, but what's interesting is that some of these sites are a little difficult to, because of there's very little artifacts or preserved organics. It's a little difficult to precisely date some of these sites. And based on diagnostic artifacts, these are localities that often get reused or used by earlier groups like late prehistoric or even woodland and earlier groups. So in some cases, it's difficult to really determine the intensity or scale of the Dismal River, the Apache presence at some of these sites. Now, in both areas, um, group ancestral Apache groups had kind of what could be described as a dual economy. There's a very strong hunting focus, primarily use of bison with secondary use of deer and pronghorn. There is some use of smaller game, but what's interesting is it's only certain species. For example, turtle, beaver, and canines, including dogs, as a subsistence uh, species. More common and readily available species like rabbit, rodents, in some cases fish or shellfish, do not seem to be used at all. Um, there is also use of a mixture of wild and domesticated plants. Uh, Locally available species like chokecherry or goosefoot, grape or spurge, Chenopodium get used pretty commonly. But they are also clearly horticulturalist. Sites are repeatedly have evidence of maize, domesticated plum, and squash being produced. Most of them seem to be sites in the east where um, precipitation is adequate to probably do dryland farming. Although there are select areas such as places along the foothills around Denver where localized climate is such that they probably do get enough precipitation for local agriculture, or at least horticulture. So over the last 10, 15 years, there's our group and a series of researchers have really tried to date this complex and has resulted in a pretty good assemblage of dates. We have almost 90 radiocarbon and some OSL dates from at least 22 different sites, which means that many of these sites have 4 or more dates per site. That we actually are starting to get a good sense of its age. And similar to the lifestyle differences between the East and the West, there also seems to be an age difference between Eastern and Western groups, with the Western sites being often earlier, starting even in the late 1200s or even a little earlier than that, and the Eastern groups showing up after 1400s. And I'll talk a little more detailed about that in a minute. With these almost 90 dates, we can start with OxCal, we can start to do some modeling to make our best estimates of what's the oldest site in the East, the oldest site in the West, and what's the age of later sites in the East and West. And what that analysis has shown is that presence in the Western plains for ancestral Apache is significantly earlier. The earliest sites are likely dating to mid 1200s to early 1400s, whereas the earliest sites in the East really only show up until about the 1500s. So there's at least a century or more of delay in the Apache presence in the eastern parts of in eastern parts of the Central Plains. Now, what's interesting is the end of the Apache presence is likely associated with the appearance of outside groups onto the plains. The Comanche uh, is very prominent, but also from disruption and expansion westward of the Pawnee and Wichita. And so the latest sites occur in around 17, early 1800s, perhaps Dismal River groups disappearing in the West earlier and extending into kind of the early 1800s in the East. Now, this is the broader kind of pattern of ancestral Apache groups. Our work has really focused on a few places in western Kansas, particularly along a relatively modest tributary called Ladder Creek in western Kansas. And even though it's not a major riverway, it has an unusually dense occupation in this region, and within a probably less than 5 mile stretch of the of Ladder Creek, there is 89 known sites within the drainage, about almost a quarter or a third of which are actually ancestral Apache. And our work um, has really focused on about 10 or 12 of these sites in this area where we've tried to reanalyze collections, doing new surveys and excavations of a series of sites, and dating as many of these sites as we can. The most prominent and most unusual that I really want to focus this talk on is the Scott County Pueblo site in western Kansas. And this is arguably one of the most unexpected or unusual sites anywhere in the Central Plains. It is a 7-room Pueblo located in western Kansas. It is by many hundreds of kilometers the farthest eastern and farthest northern Pueblo known in North America. The site, because of its unusual nature that you have a Pueblo in in Kansas, has meant that there's been an incredible amount of scientific interest and private interest in the site dating back into the late 1800s. And there's been at least 5 professional major excavations of the site starting in the late 1800s. But despite such a long history and such an extensive investigation of the site, there's been very little integration of the results of any of this work until we've started our work there. And one of the problems is because these different episodes of excavation have really focused on different parts of the site. So, for example, the earliest excavations focused almost exclusively on the Pueblo itself without trying to understand the broader site, while the later ones worked in areas away from the Pueblo and really highlighted the Apache occupation. Now, the site was first brought to archaeology's attention in the late 1880s, more or less soon after this area was settled by Americans. And locals very quickly recognized there was something unusual about this site, where they were pulling out Pueblo pottery and painted pottery in this area. So very quickly, professional archaeologists got aware of this, and it was first investigated and excavated in 1898 by an interesting pair. They weren't archaeologists. Samuel Williston and Handel T. Martin were paleontologists at the University of Kansas, but were encouraged by a series of locals and archaeologists to investigate this area, and conducted a major excavation of the Pueblo itself and a little bit of surrounding areas. But they found a Pueblo, a 7-room Pueblo, masonry Pueblo, and diagnostic Rio Grande Puebloan ceramics, grinding stones, things like that. And the unusual nature of the site's presence and the artifacts associated with it made them kind of try to figure out, how is it possible this is in Kansas? And looking at historic accounts by the Spanish, they identified that from the 1600s onward, Spanish accounts referred to a region called El Cordalejo. And El Cordolejo was poorly described in actual location, but it generally referred to kind of the Great Plains. In particular, it was an area where Puebloan families abandoning the Rio Grande Valley to avoid the Spanish uh, moved out of the Rio Grande and settled with um, Plains Apache groups living in the area. And there is a very well documented abandonment in the Southwest by families from Taos Pueblo in the 1640s through 1660s, and at least another one with the Picaris migrants in the late 1600s, early 1700s. And as a result of these historic counts of these groups moving onto the plains, um, Williston and Martin decided to refer to this site as El Cordolejo, indicating this is the location where groups such as the Taos and the Picaris moved to avoid the Spanish. Um, Nearly 40 years later, Smithsonian archaeologist Waldo Wadle came back to the site, wanting to understand this connection between plains groups and the southwestern groups, and conducted a fairly significant excavation in 1939. Not within the Pueblo, which he believed was completely excavated either because of Williston Martins or later pot hunting, but did a major excavation north and a series of excavations south, in which he found a possible kind of small, uh, kind of oblong house feature or structure, a series of trash pits, and then at least four roasting pits, along with thousands of artifacts that Wadle recognized as diagnostic of um, of Apachean groups of the recently defined Dismal River culture at this point. Now, the actual paucity of Puebloan artifacts actually frustrated Wadle, and you can see this frustration in a series of his letters where he's like, "There's nothing Puebloan here," and as a result, he interpreted the site as being entirely Apachean, but through their contact and trade with Puebloan groups over perhaps centuries, took on customs such as building pueblos and making pottery in a similar form. Um, and he rejected this idea that this was built by Puebloan migrants. Instead, he thought it was built by Plains Apache groups. Now, he didn't quite understand this, but in um, in retrospect, we realize that if you look at his profiles and his elevations of his excavations compared to where the Pueblo is, much of his excavations, particularly north, are actually stratigraphically below the Pueblo. He's digging in deeper, presumably earlier deposits. There's some support for this as in the 70s, the Kansas State Historical Society actually redug the Pueblo, and as I'll talk about in a minute, actually found features that are stratigraphically below the Pueblo and older. Um, the latest major excavation occurred in the early part of the 1970s when Kansas State archaeologist Tom Whitty returned to the site in hope of creating an open air museum, which actually continues, which does in fact exist until the present day. So you can go visit the site, and they have reconstructed with actually pretty good accuracy what the Pueblo looked like at the time of the original excavations. So part of our interest in this kind of Apachean occupation is the unusual nature of Apachean presence in this Pueblo. And we've been working on this since about 2008. And with Scott County Pueblo, we've really tried to figure out who lives there. Why did people come to the site? When was it occupied? And what happened after it was abandoned? Now, this is a, a painting by a local artist and avocational archaeologist, Charlie Norton. And whatever you think about the artistic quality of the painting, what I like about this is it shows a variety of kind of technologies and behaviors that likely occurred at the site. And this idea of looking at kind of the style of technology and daily practices is a way we've kind of tried to focus on who is actually living at the site. Now, if you look at the Pueblo itself and the artifacts from it, this site this Pueblo is unquestionably built by Puebloans and not people trying to replicate Puebloan action. It is a 7-room masonry Pueblo. It has stone-lined hearths. It has major trough metates and large rectangular, two-handed uh, monos. There's even vesicular basalt, uh, grinding slabs. At least 2 of the room have raised benches around the edges. Um, there are no doorways between these rooms. The only access to any of the room is through ladders, and each room has evidence of ladder posts, allowing access in and out of the room through the roof. And in and around this Pueblo was found uh, characteristic Rio Grande ceramics such as Tewa polychrome or Tewa plain red. There are a number of pipes that are incised and diamond shaped, very similar to those found and used in Rio Grande Pueblos. Now, in and among these diagnostic features and artifacts that indicate a Puebloan presence is literally tens of thousands of Dismal River artifacts that I've described kind of earlier. So this is a locality in which there is a combination, a co-residence of people, and I'll talk about why we think that in a minute. Indicating also the presence of Southwestern or Puebloan artisans is that you have Puebloan artifacts being made with local materials. So not only do you have diagnostic Tewa red and polychrome vessels that were likely brought from New Mexico, you have locally available clays being made into Tewa red, local copies of Tewa red. You have vessel forms like small orifice seed jars, or widely expanding serving bowls or even soup bowls that are forms that are not made by Plains people, but are forms that are made by Puebloan people. And you even have the characteristic two-handed rectangular trough monos being made by locally available Dakota sandstone. So not only these people, Puebloan people are here, perhaps not in great numbers, but they're there, and they're making tools according to their own style and cuisine preferences. Now, where did the Plains people come from? Now, while people often refer to Plains Apaches as local Plains groups, and of course they were, they have their own history that is their origins lie well outside the Great Plains. In fact, most Athabascan peoples in North America ultimately originate in northwestern Canada and far eastern Alaska, and archaeologically are well known for at least the last 2,500 years. And genetically, they're very likely much, much older populations. Now, how does a group in the Yucatan and Northwest Territory get to the plains? That's a long, complicated history. It very likely starts around 800 AD. and as best we can, seems to be associated, at least initially, with a volcanic eruption or a set of volcanic eruptions around 800 AD out of Mount Churchill, which is a volcano right on basically on the border of Canada and Alaska. But this eruption around 800 was a major eruption that left an enormous ash field across tens of thousands of square miles, um, uh, really devastating the environment in the areas of the thickest ash deposits, very likely killing plants and animals and undoubtedly people in its path. Because much of their kind of home territory um, of these Athabascan speakers were devastated by this, it's not surprising there seems to be associated with this expansion over the next century or so of the home range of these Athabascan groups in this region, moving into more Arctic areas and moving east into the Great Plains for the first time. Now, that's not surprising. What is surprising is this is also associated not just with the expansion of the home range, but a long distance, discontinuous migration of at least small numbers of Athabascan speakers that traveled hundreds, if not thousands of miles from their homeland. And is very likely the explanation for the presence of Athabascan speakers in the Pacific Northwest, moving into Oregon and Northern California, but also seems to be associated in before about 1200 into the Great Basin. Now, part of that migration into the Great Basin actually also included a small group establishing residence around right before or around 1200 AD on the Front Range of the Rockies. Now, what's interesting is these groups moved into the Great Basin and into the Rockies. They did not enter an abandoned environment. There were people filling this landscape. Last of the Fremonts were present in the Great Basin. The Plains groups had multiple people, including Antelope Creek people, the Upper Republicans, Southwestern groups. So they entered an occupied territory. But within about a century or two, very likely as a result of some social and environmental disruptions associated with the Little Ice Age, ancestral Apache people spread throughout much of the Central Plains that archaeologists recognize as Dismal River, and into the Southern Plains, represented by Terra Blanca, best known in your region, as well as what we know as the modern Navajo, the Jicarilla, and a number of other Southern Apachean groups, variously known archaeologically as the Pecos or Sierra Rojo cultures. So there was this spread starting probably in the 1400s. Now, that's why they're in the area. That's why the Apaches would be in the area of Scott County, because of this long continental-wide migration. Doesn't necessarily explain why the Puebloan groups are there, why they would travel nearly 500 kilometers. Well, very likely what's happening with the Puebloan groups and why they would abandon their homes that they'd occupied for centuries or millennia and move into an area that was frankly full in many cases of enemies and various dangers, was likely that they were trying to resist or avoid Spanish occupation. Starting in the 1500s, the mid 1500s, the invasion of the Spanish into the Rio Grande Valley caused major disruptions to Puebloan communities up and down the river valleys. And Puebloan groups responded in various ways to that appearance of outsiders, some of which were violent and uprisings and rebellions, including the famous Puebloan revolt of this in the late 1600s, in which they were actually able to kick out the Spanish, at least for about a decade or so. This smaller scale rebellions or uprisings occurred throughout centuries. But part of that rebellion or avoidance meant abandoning homes and moving elsewhere. Most of the time, they moved to other pueblos in the Rio Grande or into surrounding areas. But a number of Puebloan groups moved in with Apachean groups, mostly around the Rio Grande for the most part. But it was based on a relationship through trade that likely involved some intermarriage or regional migrations at point, where Puebloan groups and Apachean families were connected in an economic and perhaps a social sense. And so, to avoid the Spanish, they were likely of entering into cohabitation with these Apachean groups that they knew and had long-term relationships with. So it begs the question: well, how old's the Pueblo? Is in um, and so we did a series of radiocarbon dating using kind of stratigraphically defined areas. And what we realized is there's multiple occupations at the Pueblo. The Pueblo is literally built on top of an Apachean site that dates somewhere in the order of 1400 AD to the early 1600s. And it represents a camp, a long-term camp with a fairly large trash middens and pit features, much of which Wadel excavated. Um, the earlier Apache Pueblo presence doesn't actually have very many southwestern artifacts. It has a handful of trade items, some pipe fragments, some obsidian, some shells, but not much. But it's mostly almost exclusively Apachean presence and does not indicate any Puebloan people present, but does suggest that people in Western Kansas knew or at least had indirect contact with groups in the Southwest. The Pueblo seems to be built between 1605 and 1635. The importance of that is it predates any historic accounts of El Cordalejo, of groups like Taos or Picaris moving onto the plains. It's older than those historic contacts. And the Pueblo itself was built using local materials and capstone. The Pueblo itself seems to be occupied a fairly long time. In fact, that one room seems to be remodeled. Um, and in and around the Pueblo that was built are a series of large quarry pits, basically large pits dug for clay to make the Pueblo itself, to adhere to that. And then when the Pueblo was done being built, they used these big holes in the ground as trash. And you have literally hundreds of thousands of Puebloan and Dismal River artifacts filling this trash, presumably by the early occupants of the site, again, in the early 1600s. Our dating of the earliest artifacts from these trash pits indicates, again, as I said, 1605 to 1635. However, we might actually be not getting dates of the earliest occupation. The 1970s excavation actually found an abandoned box hearth pit that had been used and then destroyed and abandoned outside the Pueblo. So it's very likely the Pueblo that we know of is a rebuilding of the original Pueblo, that there was one earlier and they rebuilt it. So it's maybe even earlier than the early 1600s. Now, the site seems to be abandoned intentionally, very likely due to decay and it seems to have been burnt down, which is a very Puebloan custom upon abandoning a site to burn it down. So much of the timbers of the roof and walls were exposed, and it seems to be burnt. And we can precisely date that by dating the burning of artifacts on the surface, including much corn, to about 1650 to 1680. What's important about that is this is earlier than the Pueblo Revolt, which is historically attributed as one of the causes for the construction of the Pueblo. Now, after uh, roughly 1680, what happens? The reality is that while the Pueblo gets abandoned, the people that had lived there, the group of Apaches and Puebloan people that had intermarried and interacted associated with the early construction of the Pueblo continue, or at least their descendants continue. And so we see a series of sites up and down the valley that date after the abandonment of the Pueblo until the early 1800s, in which you see a unique mixed ethnicity community where they have abandoned some of the very obvious expressions of Puebloan culture, such as pueblos or penitentiary, but they continue to make Puebloan ceramics and technology with some adaptations. And in fact, as I said, the earliest Pueblo builders try to mimic and locally make some of the like the Tewa redware. These later groups, after the Pueblo is abandoned, actually make better copies because they have better knowledge of the clays and the firing technology. But they continue to evolve in there. So, kind of to wrap this up, what's really interesting about the plains and particularly Western Kansas is it's this unique laboratory that, as a result of a very long history of Apache migrations, but colonial kind of activities in the Southwest, have created a really unique community and a long-term community in which a small number of people, we're probably talking a couple families, created unique economic and personal bonds that brought together a group that's not entirely Apache and not entirely Puebloan, but a really interesting mixture of the two lives and the two customs and foodways and ceremonies, in which they still recognize a Puebloan homeland, but have created a new community and a new lifestyle into um, um, in the Kansas. So I want to thank Scott and Aaron for this invitation. Just want to recognize as all the people that have helped us and the funding agencies. So with that, I'll stop. I kind of went a little long. I apologize. But if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them.
You didn't go too long at all. That was perfect. But does anyone have any questions? Feel free to turn off your mics or turn on your mics. There we go.
When you talk about masonry walls, were there any dressed stones, or did they just use cobbles with adobe, or what?
So the cap rock, the caliche cap rock of the High Plains is exposed right near this site. And so they were taking they were pretty rough stones, blocks kind of quarried off the cliff face. They were not they were roughly shaped, but they weren't like finished. And then
Okay.
they used that locally excavated clay that's available to kind of as a cement to pack it together. And then they did use that same clay to plaster it. So the stones would have been hidden by a plaster covering. And in
Thank
fact, you
you.
see evidence of fingerprints and being pushed into the clay.
That's pretty cool.
So Matt, tell me about kind of the interesting stuff about combining of cultures and kind of intermarrying and things like that. Have you read any of the stuff that's like later in the Southwest, like Captives and Cousins and the Kiva and the Cross and that sort of stuff? Do you see similar things going on at an earlier date that they discuss about?
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah. So this is as a result of these Puebloan people kind of being forced out of their homes, moving. They created these relationships all over. The Navajo themselves have, recognized as part of even though they are Athabascan speakers and recognize that they have a connection to these, Canadian Athabascans, they are more more deeply connected to some of the Puebloan ancestral communities, such as in the Four Corners area, that date back to probably the 1300s, and some of their clans recognize homelands in the Four Corners areas. And so this connection and intermarriage creating kind of a slightly new community, and undoubtedly new um, um, ceremonies and rituals and things like that are ubiquitous in kind of the Southwest. Now, a number, they're particularly with Apaches, you were constantly seeing examples of captives, of kind of people captured and brought in more or less as slaves or a slave-like individuals. That is of course happening, particularly during the colonial period, because the Spanish, in fact, um, commodified slavery and made it worth people's while to give them slaves to do the labor that isn't the Spanish were having struggling to do. The problem why I don't think the kind of captive model works here is the most captives are relatively small numbers of people that are being brought in and subjugated to a dominant community. Therefore, they are in the Southwest, the Apaches are eating a Spanish diet, living in Spanish structures, using Spanish tools. What's unusual, or what doesn't fit that model, is you have Puebloans building a house, making cuisine, making pottery of their own, alongside and using Apachean tools. Later, they continue to make at least the local copies of these ceramics, but are living in Pueblo or wiki-ups, Apache wiki-ups, and otherwise a kind of Apache life. I think this intermarriage makes more sense because the Puebloan migrants, at least initially, had complete control over the construction and organization of their basic home. They were using a mixture of Apachean and their own technology within this Apachean structure. Many of these, they were living in a space in a region occupied by Apaches and full of Apaches. Well, maybe not full, but with Apache presence. So I think this blending of cultures, I think, really only comes not from an exploitative kind of captive model, but from a kind of ethogenic integration of two different groups that come together and live quite peacefully. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I guess a follow-up question is, how do you think that sort of idea explains kind of culture change in general that we see all over the world?
Well, I mean, often when two groups come together, there is always an exchange of ideas and stuff, like technologies moving back and forth. Often it's being used when there's not kind of this integration of people.
I'm sorry, Matt. Whoever has the background sound, can you mute yourself for a second?
Oh, yeah, that's me, Jesse. Sorry.
Okay, go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, so I mean, this is not uncommon. I think you see this, in various Southwestern situations, which I'm a little more aware of. You see it actually in historic settings with colonial like the English occupation of the East Coast. I actually happen to be doing a project with Jamestown And you actually see a similar thing where you have kind of intermarriage and interrelationships going on between indigenous women in this case and European men, in which these European sites are being traditional ceramics are being used to cook, traditional artifacts, traditional diet is being cooked, where there's a blending of this. Now that quickly turns into an antagonistic war economy where they kind of separate and intentionally kind of disengage and separate technologies and kind of reinforce the separation of technologies. But you see this in a lot of places. The Roman expansion is often involving this kind of local groups incorporating new technologies, maybe not exactly like the Romans, but building structures and new technologies in their own unique expression that isn't quite like what it did coming from its homeland, but is also not like what was the original people though. So this ethnogenetic mixing of groups is pretty common in just a lot of places. Now, in a lot of cases, there's one of the interesting things with these Apachean sites is there doesn't seem to be a lot of connection and interaction, at least peaceful, with the Pawnee or the Wichita. And in fact, there's probably a lot of warfare. And so you don't see goods and people necessarily going back and forth other than in that case, there's probably captives.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a small one.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, hey, it's Jesse.
Yeah.
So can you say, all right, that was, I learned a lot, but can you say something about the bioarchaeology?
Well, so there are you mean like the human
Curious
remains?
about what happened in 2008 that started off this research project in Kansas.
Oh,
No, I was talking about the bioarchaeology of the human remains.
so there is for those nearly 300 sites, I'm aware of only two burials. They actually are both, ironically, in Scott County. Um, One was dug in 1960 at a site not very
getting
far
it.
away from um, the Pueblo. It was basically about a mile away or even less. We don't know a whole lot about that burial other than a general, it seems to be a pit burial with a single individual placed in it without with a few Dismal River artifacts. There was unfortunately a more recent find very near the Pueblo. In fact, at one of these later sites that was occupied right after the Pueblo. And unfortunately, I found that one. And we were able to identify it almost immediately as a human burial before we dug very much. And as a result, we immediately stopped excavation, reburied it, and through consultation with Native Americans, we've just left it in place.
Okay,
So we don't know a whole lot about
the biology.
the biology. Other areas we know that Apachean genetic studies in the Southwest and elsewhere do indicate that one of the characteristics of Apachean migration into new area occupied by people is intermarriage. There's genetic blending within Apachean people of groups such as the Fremont and the Puebloan groups, for at least groups in the Southwest. That this is a traditional custom to intermarry into the dominant society, while still not necessarily taking on the dominant society's
Yeah, surprise.
lifestyle. But we don't know a whole lot about. There are undoubtedly a lot of other Apachean burials out there one of the problems is and this is true for most Athabascan speakers, there is a great fear of the dead and ghosts. And so when someone dies, you almost immediately abandon the site. And in fact, in some
Yeah.
cases,
Right.
you
Yeah,
abandon
right
like,
on.
and so death is something to be, and the dead are something to be avoided.
Okay.
Yeah. So we don't know
Yeah.
very much.
All right.
Oh,
Thanks, man.
Paul, you said why 2008? That was
Yes.
it. That's when I got this job. Yeah,
And
this site had been, I did my master's at the University of Kansas. So I was aware of the site, and was always interested in it, but didn't really know much about it. And so when Mark and I started our jobs here, we're like, we're gonna figure this out. We're gonna kind of, so that's why why 2008 kind of shows up and prominently, is that's when we got this job and we could actually kind of go at
okay,
it systematically.
I was just interested why, University of Iowa was working in Kansas for all that time.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately it was, for whatever reason, even though it's, like I said, it's a 125-year history. And lots of, very prominent researchers did work there. Nobody ever tried to bring it all together and figure out what the story was. Lots of people were just very happy to assume that the historic accounts explained it, or it was just a weird, like Wadles, and it was just, Plains people doing something weird, like building pueblos where they never built pueblos anywhere else but this site. And we were just tired of like the lack of information. So this is what we started.
Well, you did a nice job. Thank you.
Thank you.
So this kind of follows up on Paul's question, but the early excavations at El Cortalejo, how does it relate to 12 Mile Creek and your research that you did? And of course, you have a long history. You came and gave a presentation to the PAS in Amarillo back in, I don't remember when that was, but
Oh God, yeah.
how does that relate to kind of a broader sort of thing of Paleo Indians changing to doing research on later sites like you and Jason LaBelle and myself and a whole bunch of other people?
So it's really interesting in this case. Part of it, I mean, part of it is personal. Part of it is the University of Kansas. So the reality is both 12 Mile Creek, which I did my master's on in the mid 90s, and this project were dug by Handel T. Martin, this paleontologist that worked at there. And probably because I can't pay attention to anything for very long and I need to always do something new, I kind of was inspired by that. If a paleontologist can go find what is arguably the earliest fluted point site known to archaeology and the most unusual, Puebloan site on the plains, it was kind of this inspiration that that's the connection to me. And I love Western Kansas. Like I like being there. I like the environment. I like the people. And so, um, for me at least, you can do all of this. And frankly, one of the other big connections between Paleo Indian and these people is they're big game hunters. They're big bison hunters. They do it a little differently, and they approach it a little, the approach that research, but the landscape, they were dealing with kind of similar landscape problems of how to make a living in what is arguably a very barren environment, and seasonally, and so emphasizing mobility, emphasizing, in fact, like spurred end scrapers and shared tools. They have very thin, large bifaces. They're not ultra thin bifaces like you see in Folsom sites or Paleo Indian sites, but they're not dissimilar. And so what I liked was this, in a same environment, obviously under different climatic conditions, they are solving everyday problems in many of the same ways. And often, at least in comparison to many of the late prehistoric groups, in a different economic strategy and approach than their contemporaries. Certainly their Puebloan contemporaries and their more Eastern late prehistoric contemporaries. They were big game hunters and emphasized very extensive, spent a lot of time and energy and resources on getting bison. There is almost 30 different bison represented at the Pueblo, which is actually more than at 12 Mile Creek. It's a bigger bison kill, as it were.
Thank you, Matt.
Matt, I have a question. What you just said, a bigger bison kill site than 12 Mile Creek?
Yeah.
Where is that?
Well, so 12 Mile Creek is about not even
Yeah,
maybe
I know.
10.
I know where 12 Mile Creek is, but you were saying there's a bison kill site bigger than that.
Well, there are more bison. The predation of bison, in terms of absolute numbers of bison, is larger at the Pueblo than at 12 Mile Creek.
Really?
Yeah,
Really?
there's more, but now it's not a fair comparison. 12 Mile Creek is probably a single or short-term event. You probably have maybe a couple generations.
Yeah.
So I'm being facetious a little bit.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, they most of their hunting was focused on bison.
Okay. And you mentioned a thesis on 12 Mile Creek.
Yes, yeah.
Is that available online?
If you
That was a long time ago.
if you could email me, I can get you a copy. I
Okay.
don't know that the University of Kansas has digital versions available, and I don't think they do. But if you email me, just search my
Okay.
name at the University of Iowa, not
Yeah.
Iowa State. There's another Matt Hale at Iowa State. At the University of Iowa, I will happily send you a very embarrassing master's thesis from a much younger Matt Hill.
It's not that bad. Hey,
Excellent.
It's about the time I met Jesse and Scott. Just
that's
FYI.
what.
A long time. That's a long time ago.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Am I talking now?
Yeah.
Okay. Hey. So Matt, I was thinking about the things you said about a couple of minutes ago about how Paleo Indians go back and forth between recent and ancient, and I thought that was that was a really critical moment in my kind of development because I was so scared of theory, right? And I didn't know what theory I believed in. It was like they were all pushing theory down your throat. And then I met Van Saints, and he said, and it was a huge moment for me because I was into evolutionary ecology and all that stuff. But he said discovery is a theory. You don't need theory if you have discovery, right? And then you research it from there.
Yeah.
And I thought, that's how that guy thinks. He doesn't care how it's gonna, like, he just does his own thing. So yeah, that was a big point about what you were saying about back and forth.
Well, I think
Yeah.
that's all the time we have for Q&A. Thank you so much, Matt. That was a fantastic presentation. Always happy to have you. And I hope you'll join us again. And
Anytime.
yeah, with that,